Putting a modern perspective on the dramatic events of 17th century Britain in Civil War.
All wars are cruel, but none are as bitter as civil war. Remember Lebanon, divided communities, shattered families, a nation torn apart.
Civil wars tend to include savagery, acts of violence and reprisal against prisoners, and sometimes against the civilian population who has supported one side or the other. So civil wars are usually very unpleasant businesses indeed.
Every village, every town, every county had to make a choice, to back the king or parliament, to take sides. Today, the reenactments of the sealed knot are both authentic and entertaining, but watching them, it is easy to imagine the war as little more than a chivalrous struggle between dour, sober roundheads and long-haired cavaliers. In fact, the war deeply divided the nation. Church and state, court and country, town and village, neighbours and friends, fathers and sons.
It was arguably the most atrocious experience that the English and Welsh ever underwent. There are others, such as the Black Death, which killed many, many more people. But the Civil War disarranged people's views of government, society and religion, as well as wrecking their communities physically.
In early 17th century Britain, everything appeared peaceful enough, and no one wanted war. God ruled over the king over the nobles, the squire over the people. Everybody knew their place, and hierarchy assured order and continuity. But below the surface were eddies of discontent that would build up into a torrent of change. The nation would be engulfed in war, and British history set upon a new course. The origins of the conflict was the fear of the propertied classes that the king, who had not called Parliament for 11 years, was becoming a tyrant. But as Britain descended into civil war, the issue that concerned most people and raised most passion was religion.
Religion was immensely important to the partisan minority who commenced the fighting and sustained it. There's a crude but simple division, that those who wanted a church based upon a minimum of ceremony and a maximum of preaching evangelical religion tended to support Parliament, and those who wanted a church based upon order, ceremony, hierarchy and pomp supported the king.
The divisions in 17th century religion can still be seen in the Church of England today. The king's religion emphasised ceremony and ritual. The clergy interceded between God and the laity, for whom God is revealed through the priesthood, as reflected in the High Church service. By contrast, today's low church is nearer to the Bible religion of the Puritans. The Puritan congregations would have abhorred Catholicism and would have known that Charles's Queen was a Catholic, that his Archbishop appeared to lean towards Rome, and that scant support had been given to the Protestant cause in the European wars.
Please be seated.
The Puritan service was structured around the sermon. God revealed himself directly through the Bible and from the pulpit.
Chapter 13. And you may remember, if you were here, on the first evening that we...
Puritans took Parliament's side, adding to the political opposition to the King's government, a passionate, religious hostility to his church.
And when they go into war in 1642, I think they have a strong sense of fighting for God's cause, a sense that they're taking part in an event of cosmic significance in world history, that God, if you like, as Milton says, has chosen his Englishmen for this stage in the Christianization, purification of the world.
For the King's supporters, the Church, the authority of its bishops, the symbolism of its rituals, and the divine right of the King to rule held society together. It legitimized authority and assured order. For the Royalists, the notion that God could be revealed directly to people through prayer threatened to undermine the authority of the Church, and therefore of the state.
They see the Puritans and parliamentarians as subversive figures. They feel that in 1641 Charles has made all sorts of concessions to them. He's abandoned the prerogative courts, he's abandoned his leading ministers. He's agreed to the principle that Parliament should meet regularly, that the Long Parliament should not be dissolved without its own consent. These are major concessions for a king to make, and it hasn't stopped them.
The religious divide ran deep. In this Essex village, the local priest was forced from his living when he refused to adopt the rituals of the High Church. So he and his followers eventually built a simple chapel to worship in. The divisions in the village of Turling would not have been along class lines between rich and poor, but between the old and the new, between those content with the feudal world and those who looked for a more flexible, entrepreneurial society. Old, tightly knit villages, largely self-sufficient, often tended to side with the king. Newer, more scattered communities producing a surplus to sell in local markets were more likely to favour Parliament. The West Country was typical.
In traditional communities, in the downlands of Wiltshire and Dorset, in the chalk country, and in South Somerset, they tend to be more royalist. In the pasture country, the cheese country of Wiltshire, the adjacent parts of North Somerset, and in the Somerset levels, they tend to be in favour of Parliament.
At the time of the Civil War, Britain had an overwhelmingly rural population, but as an island, it was already a trading nation, and the towns would have been divided too. The established merchants and traders who benefited from monopolies granted or sold by the king usually had royalist sympathies. The newer manufacturers, and those outside the trading companies, on the other hand, saw these as restrictive practices. In the Merchant Adventurers' Hall in York, then a prosperous port, arguments would have ranged around religion, the failure of the king's foreign policy to deliver new markets, and the fairness of monopolies. Religion might condition how the traders of York took sides, but so would business interests. The blame for unpopular policies was put not on the king, that was still too radical, but on his evil advisers at court. When Parliament challenged them, a power struggle at Westminster began.
In essence, the Civil War was a tragic political blunder by a few individuals at the top of society, who closed into their world at Westminster and Whitehall, became so obsessed with their different visions of the country, and so obsessed with their hatreds and suspicions of each other, that they completely betrayed their greatest and most fundamental duty, which was to their country. they made war upon each other and so tore England apart.
In 1640, the king was forced to call Parliament, a Parliament determined to limit his power and replace his advisers. Opposition to Charles's policies was widespread, but the idea of taking up arms against a king was for most people inconceivable.
People at the time were dominated by traditional ideologies, one of which was the king can do no wrong, and the king is divinely appointed, and any opposition to him is sacrilege. This is a very strong feeling, I think, both among the propertied classes and among ordinary people. It was very difficult to think of opposing the king.
For 2 years, king and Parliament haggled, but when Parliament questioned Charles's God-given authority, he was determined to fight. In August 1642, the royal standard was raised at Nottingham, but still the nation held back. 21 counties signed pacts of neutrality.
There's a great deal of neutralism, people seeing which way political events at the centre are going to go before they make any decision, trying indeed to make no decision at all and not to take up arms against their neighbours. Both armies have got with them extremists who are hoping for a quick, radical military solution, and moderates who recognise that there are going to be no easy answers, whoever wins the battle.
October 1642, Warwickshire. The Battle of Edge Hill was indecisive. War would continue. Prominent and influential families across the nation had to come down on one side or the other.
There is a very understandable traditional view that certain families deliberately divided up their allegiance, half going one way, half going the other, in order to preserve the family estates. Whatever happened, I cannot find a single case in any documented past the Civil War in which this actually happened deliberately. What I can find, tragically, are cases in which father did fight son and brother fought brother because passions ran high within the family and they followed the dictates of their own consciences.
The man who carried the king's standard in battle was Sir Edmund Verney, but his son Rafe took Parliament's side.
In letters between them, it's quite clear. Sir Edmund says to his son, I have eaten his bread and drunk his wine near 30 years and cannot now forsake him, although I admit that the things which I'm fighting for are against my conscience. And Rafe replies, well, what matters to me and my contemporaries is peace and justice. And without peace you can't have justice, and without justice I don't think I want peace.
Sir Edmund Verney is buried in the family chapel. In the midst of battle at Edge Hill he had proclaimed, my life is my own, but the standard is my sovereign's.
And 'tis said that he slew 5 gentlemen that day with his own sword, with his right hand. In his left he was carrying the standard. And eventually he was surrounded and he was killed. And later on in the battle, the standard was recaptured by the Royalists, with Sir Edmund's hand still clinging to it. And on his finger he was wearing this ring, which is a miniature portrait of King Charles by Petittot.
But the family was still divided. Rafe Verney remained loyal to Parliament, but his younger brother was a staunch royalist. Yet, like so many of the antagonists, their personal relations remained good.
The Civil War starts in a relatively gentlemanly way. It's certainly, as far as the officers, the leaders, the gentlemen on both sides are concerned, this is a disagreement among friends. There's a wonderful letter of Sir William Waller to Sir Ronald Hutton, two generals who are about to fight a battle against each other, in which Waller says, how I detest this war without an enemy. I can't think of you as an enemy.
The reply from Hopton was equally warm. My affections to you are so unchangeable that hostility itself cannot violate my friendship to your person. Hopton met Waller in battle at Roundway Down in Wiltshire in July 1643. It was one of the few decisive battles of the war. Most of Waller's cavalry was driven headlong over a concealed escarpment and perished in what is still known as Bloody Ditch. The war would be long, the fighting widespread. Few could avoid it. Across the nation, men and women would be forced to take sides.
If you were a Roman Catholic, for example, you were hardly likely to support Parliament. If you were an extreme Puritan, then you would probably adhere to Parliament, not to the King. More chose sides because of the custom, their habit of obedience, their friends. If, for example, you were a tenant, it was extremely dangerous to choose any other side than that followed by your landlord.
Some people are even rational individuals. There's a classic case of a man called Sir Thomas Salisbury, who was from North Wales, and he received the declarations of both sides. He studied the role of governments in the Bible, in history, and in contemporary Europe, and after a lot of thought he decided he was going to support the king and raised a regiment of 1,200 men. Sometimes there are royal Boy Scouts like Sir Bevil Grenville in Cornwall, who had this romantic medieval vision of an outdated chivalry. As soon as his king raised his standard in the field, there was Grenville dressing up in his mind like a hero of the Middle Ages and riding off in armour to join his liege lord.
And added to this, there's a degree of cynicism. Some people, in true Vicar of Bray style, supported the side that they thought most likely to win. They supported, quite naturally perhaps, the side which was in control in their area at that particular time. And so we can see a degree of ducking and weaving and trimming as men follow the ebb and flow of the fortune of war.
A war of skirmish and siege was fought through two of the wettest years of the century. Both armies lived off the land and the people, both conscripted, both pillaged, and both sides taxed.
Taxation caused a tremendous amount of disruption. It was sporadic and it was based on extortion. In fact, most armies were a little bit like the mafia, particularly in the Welsh marches and those counties, where they were running protection rackets. If there were two armies doing the protection racket on the same village, those people had a tough time.
Take, for example, a man near Ludlow Castle in 1644. He had lost all his horses in succession, taken to mount cavaliers. He had lost his ploughshare and his spade, taken to dig the fortifications of the castle. And now he was left with no way of growing food on his farm, a soldier to care for, and the unprecedentedly heavy local tax to pay. He had been completely ruined economically, had no way of making money now. He was in terrible poverty, and he'd never heard a shot fired. The war had never come near him. What you do get are attempts by communities to protect themselves against soldiers. And you get a completely unsung heroism of local officials like parish constables, overseers the poor, local JPs, who go about their routine work of quarantining plague-infected houses, of administering poor relief, of laying up stocks of grain against time of famine, of carrying on the means of protecting the community, even while central government came crashing down about their ears.
The chivalry that had graced the early fighting began to disappear, as civilians under siege soon realized.
The consequences of being in a town which was taken by storm were so ghastly that when a siege is going badly, we very often see the civic dignitaries forming up to the military commander and begging him to make terms. It was actually far better to end the siege by capitulation, where the attacking army would be marching in under military discipline, than it was to end the siege by storm, where the attacking army would be coming in howling through breaches in the walls, its blood up, with a very high chance that civilians would be butchered and pillaged in the streets.
June 1644, the king's stronghold at York under siege, his control of the northeast threatened. When he attempted to relieve his beleaguered outpost in July, Charles was defeated at the Battle of Marston Moor. 6,000 men died. York was sacked. The York merchants found their hall requisitioned yet again. It had served as a royalist prison, as a billet and an armoury, and now became a hospital. Some of the royalist aldermen were expelled from the city. A new merchant elite was established. August 1645, Basing in Hampshire, a huge fortified house owned by the Marquis of Winchester. It was a royalist outpost in a largely parliamentarian area and an obvious strategic target.
They tried all manner of ways of trying to break through into Basing House. Starvation, they dug a great ditch all the way around the south. They used the local church St Mary's as a gun platform, even tearing up the first Marquis of Winchester's lead coffin to fire at his own house. And they even tried, John Delbia, the Dutch military engineer who was sent here in 1645, he actually carried out the first recorded poison gas attack in British history. He laid layers of wet straw soaked in brimstone and arsenic in the fields to the south of here, and when the wind was in the right direction, he ignited it so that the noxious smoke would blow in through the windows. You must imagine a scene very much like Dante's Inferno here, with the towers blazing, molten lead dripping off them, and the whole house being put over to plunder. The Marquis of Winchester's bed, for instance, was wheeled out into the courtyard and valued at £1,300. Now, when you consider the ordinary foot soldier of the New Model Army got 6 shillings a week, you can imagine the pound signs rolling over in their eyes. They're only too happy to get their hands on these goodies.
On the ground, people rejected both sides. In some places, militias were formed to keep the warring factions out of their areas and off their land.
You get the clubman movement in various counties of the south west and of South Wales, who take up arms against both armies and say, we're going to keep you out of our county. And they aren't politically motivated at all. They just say, keep out, leave us alone. And they became strong enough to force the armies to negotiate with them.
These vigilantes for peace almost became a third force. In Dorset, Cromwell had to do battle with 2,000 of them. June 1645, the village of Naseby.
Naseby had to be the decisive battle, because the countryside was so far worn down, there were no other reserves of manpower or money upon which either side could call. And that meant whoever destroyed the main field army of the other had victory within their grasp.
The king was routed on these Northamptonshire fields. Parliamentarians slashed the faces of the women they found in the royalist camp. One by one, the king's strongholds surrendered, but Charles would not accept defeat. After a second bout of fighting, the last place to fall to Parliament was Colchester. Its surrender brought vicious retribution. Royalist soldiers were transported to the West Indies. Colchester's defenders, Sir Charles Lucas and Sir George Lisle, were summarily executed. The town was sacked. This had been a truly awful war.
It's very difficult indeed to fight a civil war to a compromise. Most foreign wars do end, historically, in some sort of compromise, in a treaty, whereas civil wars tend to end in absolute victory, in the annihilation of the principles, if not the persons, of one side. And the bitterness engendered by a civil war is of a unique intensity.
Next Tuesday at 8, the life of a soldier in the Civil War battles.
England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore held back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England that was wont to conquer others hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Familiar images of 20th century battlefields bear witness to the horrors of war. Film and photographic evidence has captured a sense of battle and witnessed the fragility of the participants.
I think it's easy to get at least a feel for the reality of 20th century war. After all, our fathers perhaps fought in the Second World War, our grandfathers in the First, and there's an abundance of diaries, memoirs, film, photographs, which let us peer into the dark reality of the two world wars. So we feel strange that they're quite close to us, and in some way we can begin, if only begin, to grasp the experience of battle. But when we go back to the 17th century, it's awfully easy to get hooked on the inessentials, to see figures in bucket-top boots and plumed hats, and not to get beyond that. In other words, to let the romanticism, the veneer, conceal from us the dreadful realities of what went on in the smoky and dangerous and terrifying world of 17th century battle.
England had been largely at peace for decades. Paradoxically, the generation that experienced the calamity of civil war was only too aware of its good fortune in not being involved in war and bloodshed. Everywhere they looked, their neighbours were. Germany and much of Central and Northern Europe were locked in the titanic struggle between Catholicism and Protestantism, known as the 30 Years' War. France had suffered the horrors of civil war for over a century. The apocalypse being endured in Europe in the age of Charles I might well cause peace-loving Englishmen to shudder. The last major battle fought on English soil had been at Bosworth Field in 1485, nearly as long ago as the Napoleonic Wars are to us. There were many British soldiers, mercenaries, fighting in the long drawn-out conflicts in Europe. By the late 1620s, the Anglo-Scots Brigade fighting in the Netherlands amounted to some 17,000 men, and many of the commanders present there were to play major roles in the Civil War.
It would only take a single battle or campaign to put men into being soldiers. But if they faced battle for the first time unprepared and badly led, then they were sitting ducks. There's a story which is probably true of a party of Raw Royalist soldiers who were sent to relieve a castle in Yorkshire in 1642 and were totally routed by a field of bean poles which they saw against the sunset in a strong wind and fought with the pikes or spears of an oncoming force.
We are now at grid 552053, and we're going to move to grid 564052. Okay, we've got to be there by 14:30. Okay, synchronised watches. Time in 15 seconds, 13:50.
The fact that maps and watches were very much a rarity in 17th century armies means that the armies of the era had to behave very differently to what we'd expect armies to do now. In other words, you couldn't give a precise grid reference on a map for a start point. You couldn't give a time for a rendezvous without great risk that people simply wouldn't appear. So there were obvious locations, churches, to rendezvous at, times and dates which the participants might easily get wrong. It meant that battle was more like seduction than rape, because you had to almost agree to fight, since the technology of getting people together over ground they didn't know to a place they could scarcely imagine simply didn't exist.
At the outset of the conflict, King Charles had few arms, little money, and no secure seaports, with the exception of Newcastle. The Queen was sent to Europe to pawn the royal jewels and to buy arms with the proceeds. Parliament had control of London, the major ports, and the country's great armories.
Although it's perhaps a common myth that in England, because we had not been at war, at least not on our own shores, there wasn't an effective army, there wasn't a sufficient supply of armour and weapons to meet the requirements of war, this is perhaps untrue. From Tudor times, there'd been a militia set up in this country. Any organisation, parishes, local government, noblemen, gentlemen in the country, according to his wealth, his status, was required to provide a number of men equipped in a certain fashion for the musters, to be in readiness for war.
England was prepared for an armed conflict, but the enemy had always been perceived as a foreign force, probably a Catholic power.
The last time that England had really seriously expected to go to war was at the time of the Spanish Armada, and there was certainly still a large amount of armour from that period surviving, some of it just simply brought into use or minimally modified to the latest fashions. Some made in London, some brought in from abroad, so that the kind of army that you saw appearing on the battlefield at the beginning of the Civil War would have been very mixed in its equipment. There'd certainly be no uniformity in the type of equipment worn by the troops.
The King's army and the Parliamentary army cautiously circled each other in the Midlands. Neither side was keen on a direct confrontation. Finally, the King ordered his troops to draw up opposite those of Parliament's at the edge of a great hill, a well-known landmark in Warwickshire. On the 23rd of October, 1642, the first set-piece battle of the Civil War took place.
Here at Edge Hill is particularly poignant in that, for instance, we had 6 fathers and 6 sons on opposite sides. And it's bad enough when you're fighting your neighbours, but when your father's up on the other side of the hill, that's particularly unpleasant. And both commanders, the Earl of Essex and the King himself, found it necessary to harangue their armies. And the King rode very ostentatiously along the front of his army, making the speech along the lines of, "You will find none here but enemies and traitors." In other words, they had to be persuaded that it's all right to meet here on this Sunday morning in Warwickshire and kill your brothers and your fathers and your cousins and your neighbours who happen to be on the other side. in this valley in front of us, 20 or 30,000 men, every company with a vast colour, 2 meters square. Trumpets sounding, drums playing, clattering of horses, a tremendous crowd gathered, and the effect on those villagers, it must have been quite traumatic. Suddenly, these 2 great armies, the shaven-headed young men from London, it's like Arsenal and Millwall arrive on a Sunday morning in Warwickshire. And they came to push of pike, enormous rugby scrum of perhaps between 10 and 20,000 men, and sheer weight and force and determination.
It's a dark, stamping, stinking mass. It's very difficult to hear what's going on. Your vision probably goes no further than the helmet back of the man in front of you. Pikes are long and cumbersome weapons. You're in some danger from the pike butt of the soldier in front, as well as from the pike point of a soldier several ranks behind you. And fighting under those circumstances, I think, is absolutely ghastly.
There's a tremendous difference between modern 20th century warfare and warfare in the 17th century. That's really dictated in many regards by the nature of weapons. Firepower, machine guns, artillery, shells mean that the battlefield is far more spread out. You don't bunch together because a mortar round could wipe out a whole company if you do. Now, in the 17th century, men fought in groups. They didn't fight as individuals. If you look at a picture of a 17th century English Civil War battle, no one, not even the king, is on their own. Men were in groups of infantry or cavalry and almost locked together in an iron box.
The injuries from a musket ball were quite horrific. The entry wound would be perhaps half an inch across. If it went through your body, the exit wound would be the size of a dinner plate. There wasn't really much point in picking you up. And when these musketeers ran out of ammunition, they simply reversed their muskets and used them as clubs. And the fog of war would gradually fill the valley. Officers would lose control, and the most tremendous noise of battle. And very few people really would know what was going on.
The first battle had been fought. Ordinary men were now baptized soldiers. Both sides claimed victory, but in reality the outcome was inconclusive. Now that the shooting war had started, the opportunities for a negotiated peace declined.
I think a political solution was possible for quite a long time, certainly until the very early part of 1642. Now, the problem was that once both sides were in arms, it then became less and less likely that a political solution could be found, because both sides were polarizing, and they were dragging the political nation and much of the rest of it with them. The Earl of Manchester recognized the problem when he said that if we beat the king 99 times, he's still king, and if he beats us once, we shall all be hanged and our posterity made slaves. And he'd hit the nail on the head, that once Parliament was in arms against the king, it was going to be very, very difficult to stop without some sort of solution which would result in the parliamentarian war aims being accomplished. So the more the war was fought, the more it was likely that only a military solution would bring it to an end.
For 3 years, Britain withstood the tramp of arms. Conventional battles scarred the landscape from the highlands of Scotland to the moors of Cornwall. In 1643, the king seemed to win the upper hand, and reinforced with troops from Ireland, victory almost came within sight. But slowly the pendulum began to swing towards Parliament with its greater resources. In another great battle at Marston Moor in July 1644, the result was still a stalemate. By now both sides were becoming more desperate, realizing that only by a total victory in arms would their enemy be cowed into submission.
The comment made by a Frenchman about his country's wars of religion fits the English Civil War almost equally well. We fought the first year like angels, the second like men, and the third like devils. For the first couple of years of war, there were enough people upon each side who had been old friends or who cared about the countryside over which they were fighting to keep it relatively low-key and relatively well-behaved. But around 1644, things began to turn very nasty in quite a few places, because both sides began to put into command over districts people who had no association with them before, and were put over them specifically because they would screw them unmercifully to obtain the mechanisms of war, and wouldn't pay any attention to the complaints of the people. And there were very nasty moments. There were garrisons who had their throats cut en masse after they'd surrendered. There were foraging parties taken prisoner and hanged en masse. It was not altogether a nice war.
The armies of both sides were poorly and irregularly paid. They were both reliant upon looting as a means of income and survival. The pillaging of towns and villages became a feature of the war as time went on, extending the war from the military to the civilian population. As the occupation and control of territory became more important, it became a war of sieges rather than of battles. Many of the great houses of England were left in ruins, like Basing House in Hampshire.
Sieges began to play a far more prominent part in the English Civil War, basically because most troops were tied down in garrisons. If you occupied an area, you could draw in supplies. So by occupying a town, you could draw in the supplies from that area. And both armies were dissipated in all these tiny and sometimes large garrisons right from the length and breadth of the country. And of course, the poor old ordinary citizen living in between suffer from both sides. One week, Parliament may come in, tax the people of the village, move out. A few days later, the Royalists might come in, tax it, then find out that they'd already paid tax to the parliamentarians and fine them as well on top of this. So it was an extremely unpleasant time for anybody that actually lived in the locality of one of these petty garrisons.
Bristol was a busy seaport with control over the route to the west. It was an attractive prize. Initially, it tried to stay out of the war, but in 1643, Royalist forces occupied the city.
The Royalist occupation of Bristol must have been sheer hell for most of the people. For a start, the citizens had to support the very heavy taxes imposed by the Royalists to fund their war effort. And they started with a clean slate because the city had been plundered bare when the Royalists took it. The fact that it surrendered meant it wasn't actually massacred according to the rules of war, but it could be plundered, and that's what happened. Plague broke out in 1645, thereby increasing the misery of the place, and it all came down to a final tragedy upon the 10th of September 1645, when the city was stormed for a second time, this time by Parliament, and was looted bare once again. The experience was one, I think, of almost unrelieved misery, and it lasted for a very long time.
One of the problems with the Civil War is it's often depressingly easy to deny your enemy the status of a legitimate combatant. And you argue that because he's fighting you in a civil war, he shouldn't really be in the field at all. You are just, and he's a traitor. And this meant that in many circumstances, prisoners were not well treated. Much, I think, depended on the circumstances of capture.
Let's strike at Hopton Castle in Herefordshire. That was held by a small parliamentarian garrison. In March 1644, it was besieged by Royalists under Michael Woodhouse, and they stormed the outer defences. The wretched soldiers inside threw down their arms and surrendered. They were bound, taken outside, and tied up on the ground with a shallow trench dug at their heads. Their throats were then cut one by one, their lifeblood ebbed away into the trench, after which their lifeless bodies were tipped in and the earth sprinkled over them, a method used for slaughtering flocks of sheep in the Welsh marches at the time. It's a scene worthy of the activities of the Gestapo in Poland in the last war.
In the Second World War, for instance, if you tried to surrender, you had about a 50-50% chance of having your surrender accepted. In the English Civil War, large numbers surrendered and were able to do so. For one thing, they spoke the same language. For another thing, the weapons meant that the fighting took place closer to one another. So you could see each other and understand what was going on. Now, there were exceptions. The people who were treated badly were the Irish. And the Irish were regarded almost as subhumans, as to use the American expression in the Vietnam War, as gooks who could be wasted at will. They weren't really people.
The question of prisoners and the treatment of Irish soldiers has come to light in a town that was frequently in the front line throughout the Civil War, the town of Abingdon. Below the ground of this quiet market town lies evidence of Civil War horrors that has recently come to light in an archaeological dig being carried out on a building site. The discovery was surprising even to the archaeologists.
What came as a surprise when we started excavating in the vineyard was to find a lot of burials laid north-south. Now, mostly when you find north-south burials, they prove to be Roman, because Christians traditionally are buried east-west, so that you rise to meet your Maker. However, we rapidly realized that these were not Romans, because not only did one have a musket ball in his chest, but others had coins of Charles I with them. The reason for the north-south burials is because, of course, these people were Puritans, and the Puritans were reacting against the papist traditions of the Anglican Church, and so deliberately didn't bury east-west. They wanted to be perverse and different, and so they buried north-south. We know that prisoners in Abingdon were severely treated by the commanding general, Richard Browne, because there is this saying that in Abingdon, execution precedeth trial. And that was because Richard Browne summarily executed the Irish prisoners that were captured. These are the Irish who were in the employment of the king. And Richard Browne seems to have delivered summary justice to them. And it's possible that some of the people that we're finding in our Civil War burial ground are the victims of Browne's summary justice.
Abingdon, like most other communities in Britain through the Civil War years, suffered casualties, not only as a direct cause of the fighting, but also from the diseases and fevers that followed in the wake of travelling armies.
Disease was an absolute scourge through this area in the middle of the 17th century. In between 1640 and 1643, the burial rate in Abingdon quadrupled. So 4 times as many people were buried in 1643 as 2 or 3 years earlier. And most of those died not from fighting, but from what was called at the time the army fever, which was a kind of plague that went through the community. It was brought by the army as a result of so many people moving about in unhygienic conditions. And it then passed into the local population. So in our burial ground, many of the dead are women and children.
Slowly, Parliament realised the need to organise an efficient, well-trained, well-disciplined, and most importantly, a properly paid army. In 1645, this new model army appeared for the first time. On the 14th of June, the new model army finally caught up with the King's forces in Northamptonshire, outside the tiny village of Naseby. After a fierce battle, Parliament's forces routed the King's army. 4,500 royalist soldiers were taken prisoner, and 1,700 men were left for dead. there are no cemeteries honouring the dead of 17th century battlefields, and historians can only estimate the losses of the civil wars.
A very large number of people got killed. I've done a computer-based survey which shows, about 100,000 war casualties, battle casualties in England and Wales in the 3 civil wars. And I'm glad to say that Thomas Hobbes, who was around at the time, tends to agree with the computer on that one. Now, how can you put that in relative terms, particularly if you add in the people who died from war-connected disease? Maybe another 50, 70,000. That's in England and Wales. Add in Scotland, add in Ireland, where the fighting was brutal and long. You're talking about 250,000, 300,000 people. And in relative terms, that's the highest loss that the British Isles have suffered in a war, with the exception of the First World War. And that's an awful number of people dead.
Next week, the British Revolution calls for liberty, democracy and religious freedom. That's at the same time of 8 o'clock.
If I give her to you, what will you give me in return? Jacket.
How can I place a value on something so precious?
So they didn't think in terms of any predecessors. And therefore, they don't know they have to have ideologies or constitutional programs. That all these things were being fumbled for.
The British Revolution was the first to call on liberty. Ideas welled up apparently from nowhere, to which neither of the warring parties, the King nor Parliament, subscribed.
I would want to emphasize the intellectual ferment of the 40s and early 50s, in which you got, for a short time, complete freedom of the press, complete freedom of religious organization, complete freedom of discussion.
State religion, the Church of England under Archbishop Laud, crucial to the government of Britain, was attacked by the Puritans.
The Civil War produced a breakdown in the established church. It produced the collapse of censorship. The result is there's a tremendous ferment of ideas, of publication, circulation of experimental ideas. It bears out all the things that Laud had said, I suppose, about religious toleration, about the Puritans, that unless you kept them in order, terrible heresies would arise.
The social hierarchy around which society was organized was challenged by the levellers.
What they are opposing is the state's control of people's ideas, of people's lives. Because they're living in a society that's very strictly hierarchical. People are born into a society where they're told that the king's control over the country, the father's control over the household, are analogous to and supported by God's control over the people.
For 20 years, radicals would effectively become a third force, a revolution within a revolution. Their demands for religious and political freedom created an alarm completely out of proportion to their numbers.
Their importance is in frightening people. The fear that society would dissolve, that servants would rebel against the authority of masters, children against parents. All that seems to be happening when the Levellers raise the issue of shouldn't all men be entitled to vote.
Such fears were reflected in contemporary documents. This cartoon shows radicals hacking away at the foundations of the state, trying to pull down its sacred institutions. Radicalism and dissent had a long tradition in Britain, but criticism of church and state would have been confined to taverns and back rooms. Such ideas were subversive. Expressing them was dangerous. Religious dissent could lead to persecution. Radicalism was mainly found in the skilled underclass of artisans and labourers. Printing, the way ideas in the 17th century were broadcast, was censored, controlled by the licensing of printers. But just before the war began, censorship broke down and publishing boomed. Pamphlets on all kinds of religious and political matters found a wide audience in a surprisingly literate population.
Freedom of the press meant something different then from what it would today, because a printing press was a small bit of kit that any single person could carry about with him. So you don't need capital, or vast capital, to print a pamphlet. It's a cheap job. So anybody can take part in this discussion, and jolly nearly everybody did, at least people from all social classes did. And you got a ferment of discussion then, which seems to me to have been decisive for the intellectual history of England.
The war began indecisively. The two opposing armies were a motley band of local militias. Discipline and leadership were often poor. Cromwell saw that if Parliament was to win, it would need a cohesive and disciplined military force. The result was the new model army.
Charge your pikes! Ring!
Cromwell, a Puritan himself, understood the need for religious freedom.
It wasn't until you got Cromwell grasping the point that religious toleration, freedom of discussion, was the essence of army morale, and the one thing that his side had and the royalists couldn't have. He encouraged this positively in his army.
The soldiers discussed liberty of conscience, the injustice of poverty, and the misuse of wealth. The most radical, the Levellers, wanted to create social, political, and economic equality.
All the leaders of the Leveller movement experienced persecution while they were campaigning for religious liberty, for freedom for individuals to gather together and to worship according to their own lights. And the radical extension of that for them was the realization sometime around 1645 that there would never be religious freedom until there was political freedom. That while the state remained as it was, you would never be able to extract religious freedom from it. And this leads them to develop a theory of natural rights, what we'd now call human rights, that individuals have rights which no state should be able to take away from them.
When the fighting stopped, Cromwell's soldiers began to behave more like a trade union than an army. They demanded back pay and indemnity for crimes committed under orders in what had been a savage war.
The army is left, if you like, to pick its heels at the end of the Civil War. No battles to fight now. It's a breeding ground for radical ideas. And the people who, I suppose, make best use of that are the people we call the Levellers, whose ideas about the origin of all just power lying in the people carry more and more conviction.
In line with the radical pamphleteers, they challenged the idea that the king's power was authorized by God and the notion that power should reside with Parliament. Their manifesto came off the presses.
They were arguing that the sovereignty belonged to the people, and the sovereignty of the people from that moment to this has remained the most radical idea. It didn't belong to the king, didn't belong to Parliament, belonged to the people.
Putney Church was the scene of a great debate. Here, the soldiers' representatives argued their case with the army grandees.
I do verily believe that there is no man but will say that the foundation of all law lies in the people.
Our lives to recover our birthright and privileges as Englishmen. If we had not a right to the kingdom, we were mere mercenary soldiers.
Have a liberty and power to alter and change their constitutions if they find them to be weak and infirm.
What these men are saying is something actually very radical indeed, which is that all power tends to corrupt, and therefore all existing forms of government, being shown to be tyrannical, should be removed, that the people should remove and destroy all existing forms and create a new form of government which is much more accountable to the people. That no one should be allowed to exercise authority for more than a very short period of time, and at the end of that short period of time they should have to account for their actions to those who elected them. And this radical decentralization of power is the central feature and is really a very, very striking and very radical statement on their part.
Cromwell decided to purge his army of these radicals. 2 mutinying regiments were confronted at Burford Church and 3 of their leaders shot. Other leading radicals were committed to the Tower. Levellers' Day at Burford Church in 1990.
And you can actually look at the levellers. Suppose they'd been that much stronger. Suppose they'd won the heart of the whole of the Cromwellian army. Suppose Cromwell had been forced to adopt their platform rather than roll it back and smash it. What sort of society, what massive differences, how much perhaps more advanced the whole human race might now be in terms of its sort of social organisation.
But levellers were not only found in the army. The true levellers, or diggers, tried to realise their ideals by setting up communes, squatting on land which once had been common.
What's remarkable about them is the fact that they take a demand for equality to a very literal level. They say that people have a right to the land, that it shouldn't be the case that some people own the land and the products of the land and that others don't. They say that everybody should have a right to own land. Let's get rid of, or alternatively, let's get rid of land ownership altogether.
None of the communes survived, but the idea of secular communal living still has a place in British society, and the diggers' respect for the earth strikes a contemporary chord.
Because they felt that the land in itself contained God and was God, that the way that we related to the land was a matter of absolute moral importance, that we should relate to the land as something that loved us and gave birth to us. Some of the digger pamphlets replaced the word of God with the word God with the word nature, the sense that we should relate to the planet that we live on in a way that is loving and is caring.
But radicalism in the Civil War was not only political, it was also directed at religion. In 1640, there was no notion of progress as we understand it. The world was not a logical but a mysterious place. Life could not be ordered and controlled by reason. Death struck at random. Crops failed without warning. The world was frightening. Life hard. God, nature and fate were to be appeased by religion, magic and ritual.
They need God to explain the physical laws of the universe as well as the moral laws. It's a very vulnerable world they live in. It's a world in which disease strikes randomly and without any rational explanation. It's a very brutal kind of world in which the love of God and the presence of God is so fundamental to being able to cope.
An authoritative God and church made the world seem more secure and meaningful. Its rituals a reassuring part of everyday life. But during Charles's reign, services had become more ornate, the clergy more remote. To the Puritans, the church seemed increasingly irrelevant, aloof and spendthrift.
A tenth of their income is likely to be taken away in order to support the clergy and the maintenance of the church. There are going to be very heavy church rates for the maintenance of beautiful buildings like this. And certainly under Charles I, these costs are going to go shooting up because Charles will want to beautify and improve the churches. And so, again, there'll be quite a lot of dispute about whether or not people are getting value for money from the church as a result of this.
If you think of being in a church, surrounded by people like yourself, raggedly dressed, who don't perhaps earn enough to live very comfortably, your children may not live very long. You're sitting here, and sitting a few rows away from you are people much more finely dressed, who are from a different class, who have a different way of life. And there at the front is this man dressed up in his posh robes and prancing around with various valuable objects that he's requiring you to admire. If you then want to set up your place of worship and your way of life, one of the first things that you might want to get rid of is those trappings, those symbols.
Everyone had to attend church. The clergy interceded between the congregation and God to reveal and interpret for them God's purpose. However, people increasingly sought God without the help of clergy. Together with their friends and their Bibles, they interpreted God's will for themselves. This required religious liberty rather than revealed religion.
The whole organization of parishes broke down, and you got people able to meet freely in spontaneous congregations, which we call dissenting sects. But they weren't sects at all. They were just individuals getting together in a pub or in a private house, listening to a chap who led their discussions. And for 20 years there was a free-for-all.
A remarkable record of the texture of the times is preserved at the British Library. 22,000 documents, pamphlets, cartoons and broadsheets were collected at the time by George Thomason, a London bookseller. Amid the polemics and the pieties, the disputations and the humour, is found soul-searching personal testimony.
The surviving autobiographies of the period often talk about people going through periods of great loneliness, thinking that they're the only person who thinks that something with the world is wrong, and then going off and travelling and finding others. So people went, they would go to marketplaces, they would go and stand outside courts, they would go to churches, any place where others would gather in numbers and speak.
Amongst the itinerant preachers, the Quakers were the most radical and numerous. It was customary to call your superiors you and your equals thou. Quakers only used thou.
The Quakers refused to take their hats off to magistrates, a mark of deference which was expected and conventional, and that seemed a horrifying idea. They were very mobile. They roamed up and down the country. They would interrupt religious services, established Puritan religious services, interrupt the preacher, demand to hold disputations.
They would, as they said, go naked for a sign, asserting that we're all the same, that we're simply human beings, that our social status should be disregarded, and also part of saying that they're God's children, and that therefore they can be as innocent and as true and as self-revealing as children.
The Quakers held out on the subject of tithes, or were much tougher than anyone else. They went to jail, they refused to pay, they kicked over the traces at every stage of prosecution. It was rather like the poll tax. They took an absolute line of refusing to pay. A lot of other people who didn't take that line rather admired them for it.
The other sorts of things that Quakers would do would include things like speaking for and on behalf of God, opening their mouths and claiming that everything that follows is coming direct from God. So when I tell you now that if you don't start treating your wife better and spending more time with your children, that God will punish you, I would say it with a kind of assertion, a kind of self-confidence that would be really quite startling, because it would be God's voice speaking through me.
At worship, Quakers only spoke when the inner light, God within them, moved them. They believed that God spoke to them directly as individuals, and God didn't say to Quakers what he said to bishops. Nothing, not even the Bible, the church, nor the law of the land took precedent over these revelations. The Quakers challenged religious authority, the Levellers, political power, the twin pillars of 17th century society. In a world turned upside down, nothing was sacred, nothing unthinkable, nothing unimaginable, not even women preachers.
The first radical woman preacher whose work I met was Hester Biddle, who in 1655 published 2 pamphlets on the same day, one called Woe to Thee, City of Oxford, the other called Woe to Thee, Town of Cambridge. So what she's attacking is the 2 university towns in England of the day. She attacks them for the way in which they are promoting the wealth and the social status of some people, and therefore making powerless and impoverished other people. And in her pamphlet, she threatens to burn them to the ground. She threatens to do that in God's name.
The universities were part of the privileged world. The law was written in legal French and medical textbooks in Latin. The radicals argued that this was to keep them from the people. They must be translated into English. Such demands were subversive. Anarchy and heresy were stalking the land. The Civil War had ended with the beheading of God's representative on earth, the king. This libertarian revolution had to be stopped if religious and political life was to be stabilized.
Something has gone terribly wrong. If they've been fighting in God's cause, if this has been a providential revolution, why is there this wickedness and heresy in the land? Is it a divine punishment? Is it not the duty of the Puritan magistrate to suppress these monstrous heresies? And in 1656, this issue reaches a climax over the case of James Naylor, the Quaker who had ridden into Bristol, followed by adoring women, an act that was seen to be, or interpreted to be, a mockery of Christ's entry into Jerusalem. He's tried by Parliament, pretty savagely punished, but the debate brings out the deep-seated anxieties and neuroses of the gentry on that subject.
Naylor's tongue was holed to stop him preaching. He was flogged through the streets of Bristol and London. The dissenters were silenced. In the cold light of the Restoration, the old world returned. In 1660, the king's son, Charles II, was restored to the throne. The authority of the church was reasserted and censorship reintroduced. Religious toleration was stifled and political discussion suppressed. The radical moment had passed, but the ideas live on.
Reading a woman saying, I am born equal to any man. Reading a woman saying, nobody has a right to own another human being, and therefore slavery must be wrong. What I have is a very powerful sense of recognition. I know these things to be true as well. I don't know these things because these women told them to me. I know these things because I live in a society which also has its own radical positions and radical groups that are pressing for change.
I think the rediscovery of our tradition is very important in current politics. That's my main interest, because I'm not an academic historian. People suddenly come across old books, old ideas, old record, and it's like meeting a long-lost relative. You realize you're related. You realize that there is a blood connection between what they did and what you feel.
The Revolution had laid the foundations of British radicalism and its tradition of dissent. Religious liberty, civil rights and democracy all have their roots in the Civil War. The debate had subsided. The revolution had run its course. Yet the ideas would reappear where and whenever people felt the call of liberty. And the series continues next Tuesday at 8 when it examines the execution of Charles I and the establishment of Cromwell's Commonwealth.